Welcome to the World of Rare Disease, a show that focuses on awareness and education about rare and complex disorders. I am Lisa Deck, a Rare New England Committee member. In this episode, we will be discussing genetic testing in Huntington's disease. Huntington's disease is an inherited rare disease that causes the progressive breakdown of nerve cells in the brain. Huntington's disease has a broad impact on a person's functional abilities and usually results in movement, cognitive, and psychiatric disorders. Most people with Huntington disease develop signs and symptoms in their 30s and 40s. To speak on our subject today, we have invited Seth Rotberg. Seth is a rare disease advocate and motivational speaker who is passionate about bringing his personal experience to better support the health community. He has done over 18 talks, with the most notable ones being at TEDx Natick and the Global Genes Patient Advocacy Summit. Seth's passion is driven by his mother's 17-year battle with the rare genetic disease known as Huntington's disease. We are thrilled to welcome Seth here to talk about his personal story, which has now led to a professional career. Welcome, Seth. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me, Lisa. I appreciate it.
Of course. I would love for you to start off our show telling a little bit in your words about your experience with Huntington's disease.
Absolutely. So it really started probably when I was 8 or 9, when my family noticed my mom was kind of acting different compared to my friend's parents. She had poor balance, wobbly movements, tripping, falling over. We had neighbors thinking she may have been drinking during the day, mood swings. She would be very forgetful. And over the years, the doctors would just say, oh, maybe she has bipolar disorder and major depression, because it could have been resulted from losing her mom, and maybe that was just a cause of it. But over time, we realized it kept getting worse and worse, where one moment I'm talking to my mom, everything's fine, and the next she's angry or frustrated or simply just depressed. And it got to the point where my dad and I and a few aunts and uncles had an intervention with my mom. At this time, my older sister, was off to college in Arizona, and we really just gave my mom an ultimatum saying, hey, my dad and I just couldn't deal with it anymore, and we're saying we either have to bring you to a mental facility to get evaluated or we're leaving. And she was not a happy camper, let's just say that.
Wow, yeah.
Eventually, after all these, blood work and evaluations, they found out my mom was officially diagnosed with Huntington's disease, which I may refer to as HD.
Mm-hmm.
And we officially learned that when I was 15 years old.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's a long time not knowing and wondering and, being scared, I'm sure. So what happened from there?
From there, my parents sat me down at the kitchen table, told me about it, but again, it was new to them, and so it was new to me. And just like any other 15-year-old kid, I Googled. I went to the power of Google. Google, what is Huntington's disease?
That had to be scary.
Yes. I mean, seeing all the symptoms of the condition and seeing how my mom already had a lot of them, and then saying, oh, there's no cure, and she has 10 to 20 years once being diagnosed.
Wow.
So my mindset was like, well, this stinks.
Mm-hmm.
What do I do? And I was in denial, because I realized it was going to change my whole life. It was going to change the way I lived life, and I lost out on that normal childhood that a lot of my friends had. I had to take on additional responsibilities at home, take my mom out to have her do her errands, even though it's laundry, but, laundry,
Right.
the dishes,
Right.
I didn't want to be at home all the time, so I'd often actually go to friends' houses, stay after school longer, play sports. I was a big basketball guy, so I would just try to stay away as much as possible, because I wanted that normal life that I knew I was losing out on.
Mm-hmm. Wow. So I know a little bit about your story. I know eventually you decided that you needed to learn more about how this impacted you, and do some genetic testing as you got older. How did you come to that decision, and tell me a little bit about that?
So when I was a freshman in college is when it really hit me. I started doing more research on it because I would forget something that my friend would say, or I would drop my phone or trip over something and would think, okay, this reminds me of my mom. Is this Huntington's disease? Is this just me being just clumsy or just a typical college kid? I eventually had a conversation with my aunt and my sister about this, saying, I think I want to test, but I'm not sure. What do you guys think? And not saying they talked me out of it, but after talking with them, I realized, okay, I'm not ready to test. It's a big decision because Huntington's disease is genetic, 50-50 chance. Not only am I at risk, but my sister is too. And it's not like if I have it, she doesn't, and vice versa. We both could have it. We both may not have it. But eventually, 5 years after finding out about the condition, when I was 20 years old, I decided to go through genetic testing. Found out I tested positive, so gene carrier. Very different from a lot of times people say, okay, so that's diagnosed with it, but I'm pre-symptomatic. Still doesn't make it any easier because I saw my mom slowly decline after 17 years. I've lost friends to the condition. I've seen people get worse and worse, and knowing that's where my future may end up is very tough mentally, emotionally.
I'm sure, yeah, it's definitely something that, that's a big burden, and to take it on at 20, never mind having to be, grow up so quickly at 15. So you're really struggling at times with that emotion, I'm sure. In learning that you had that, how has that changed you? How is that? Tell me a little bit about that process. I mean, did you talk to your parents about it? How did it work like that?
20-year-old Seth was college kid going to UMass Amherst. My mindset was I didn't want to tell anyone in my family. I was very nervous, I think, because I didn't want my mom to ever find out. I didn't want her to feel guilty, whether I tested positive or negative. And I didn't want to add more stress to my dad, being the caregiver for my mom, sister being at risk as well. I didn't want her to feel pressured.
Wow.
And in all reality, it took actually about 3 years to tell my dad and my sister, because I just wasn't ready to tell them, and I, in a way, was trying to protect them. I value family a lot. I didn't want them to worry about me, even though I realized after the fact that it's important to tell family and get that support. But there's a lot of things that I kind of wish I could have done differently. For example, going through genetic testing, I didn't go through a genetic counselor, which I value a lot, and I'm sure we'll touch about it at some point. And I didn't go through a specialist who knew a lot about Huntington's disease. My specialist was a referral from my primary care physician, and he asked me about the basics that I already knew, but at the end of the day, I don't think there was the right preparation of, okay, what happens if you test negative, or what happens if you test positive? Ultimately, I told a few friends and kind of kept it hidden for quite some time until I became more comfortable with that being a part of my life.
Right. I guess when you think about it too, I mean, you're 20 years old, you have heard about this genetic testing thing, but I mean, I was sick in my early 20s, and you just start figuring it out as you go. So I'm sure you were like, okay, I'll just ask this doctor, and now looking back, I'm sure there's a lot of lessons learned like you touched on. Is there a few more things? Say that I decide I want to go for genetic testing, and what advice would you give somebody who is in that situation?
I would definitely let them know, or not necessarily say they should do this, because it's a personal choice.
Absolutely.
Testing is definitely very personal, and it is interesting because I've talked to friends about it. I've talked to people outside of the Huntington's disease space or outside the health space, and a lot of them would say, yeah, I would get tested right away. But what they don't realize is the impact it may have on you and how you go about your everyday lifestyle. It really does change how you live and how you really want to continue to, I guess, live your life through family planning, your career, romantic relationships.
Right.
So ultimately, I honestly think people and I said I wouldn't say should, but should try to go through genetic counseling. So a genetic counselor helps prepare someone both pre and post testing for their results, whether they test positive or negative specifically for Huntington's disease or any other genetic condition. I think it's important because even if you test negative, you may feel disconnect from your community. You may feel like, hey, I still want to be involved, but how do I get involved? You may feel like, you aren't a part of something even though you want to be. But then also if you test positive, what are those next steps? And who do you talk to? And what type of resources are out there? And I think a genetic counselor will help you make sure you have those resources in hand, whether it's life insurance, long-term disability care, among other things that are going to help maybe connect you with other people who are going through the similar experience. A lot of times now, being the person who's gone through it, I talk to a lot of people in the Huntington's disease space about my experience and making sure that they know they can always ask me any questions, or I can connect them to the right social worker, support group, or just simply resources that they're looking more for.
Right. That actually leads me beautifully into the next question. And I think it's amazing to see what you have gone through. And, you took your time figuring it out, but now that you have, you are giving back. And so I'd love to hear your involvement about the Huntington's community. I know you are very involved in the nonprofit organization, and, you have, like you said, it changes your goals. It changes kind of who you are sometimes when something like this, So what has that led to for the Huntington's community? And I happen to know that they're all very happy to have you because you bring a lot of insight and education, but I'd love for you to tell our viewers what that means.
So when I got my positive test results, at that time I realized I had two options. One is not do anything, don't get involved, or use the results as motivation to get more engaged, fight back, and make a difference. And luckily I chose the latter, as you mentioned. It really started with a 3-on-3 basketball charity event that I did with a good friend of mine in Natick. And from there I was like, I want to get more involved. So I joined like a local chapter board, and then I joined this youth organization under this large national organization known as the Huntington Disease Society of America. And then I became president of both of them because I really just was driven, and I wanted to do as much as I can, not just for my mom, but I knew it really impacted myself. And for those few years that I didn't really tell many people, I was always saying, yeah, I'm doing this for my mom, I'm doing this for friends who are impacted by it. But deep down inside, I knew I was also doing it for myself. And over time, I really shifted my focus more on this younger generation, these young people who I think are the future leaders or our current leaders of the health space. And luckily for me, there's this organization called the Huntington Disease Youth Organization, also known as HDO, whose mission is to support young people impacted by HD worldwide through, social and emotional support, educational content, making sure that they have the right resources when they're dealing with their everyday challenges. So we do support young people up to the age of 35. And my goal was to really not only share my story with these young people, but making sure that they're connected to each other. Because that whole idea of isolation, right?
Absolutely.
And being like, okay, well, I don't know anyone in my community. Who do I reach out to? And luckily for me, when I was 20, right before I tested, there was a young woman who lived down the hall from me in college, and she's like, oh, my friend's coming to visit, and her mom has HD. And I said, what? There's other young people out there? And
wow.
It's such a great way to connect because you don't have to explain it, and they just know. And over time, I've really got to know other young people, not only in the HD space, but who are impacted by a rare chronic condition, and understanding that we have different set of needs than an older adult. And not saying that's older adults aren't important, because they are, but how do we also address the issues and the unmet needs, such as how do you cope with it? How do you, again, romantic relationships, family planning, career, do you change your career to be financially well off? These are things that are always going through our heads, and ultimately we don't want to lose out on that quality of life, where I think when we start having these conversations, it's important, it's invaluable, and So with HDO, we provide, educational content through our website. We're actually translated now, I think, in 14 different languages. So again, it is worldwide. It's really just trying to make sure people have that educational content so that when they are searching for those answers, they can say, okay, I'm finding the right information, versus, saying going to WebMD or Wikipedia and finding stuff and it's intimidating. And then from there, it's like, okay, well, let's connect you with the right services. So let's connect you with our director of youth services who oversees young people in the U.S., or let's connect you to someone else in a different country that can help you and make things more manageable. So my role on the board is really just try to not only work with our 3 full-time staff members, but also try to engage young people and know they're not alone and make sure that they're getting the support and resources as needed.
As a young survivor and chronic patient, when I was in my 20s, I didn't have that support of peers, and it wasn't as easy to get. It was a little while ago, and so hearing that support is so key in connecting people, and it's great that Huntington's has that. One question, I didn't put this on the paper, but I'd love for you to elaborate a little bit, is perspective shift. I'd love to hear emotionally how your perspective has changed over the years, because I can see how you have, you didn't give in. You're fighting back. You've even picked this career that's leading you into, making a difference. But has your perspective changed? Because I think that's something that happens that not everybody talks about. And so I'd love for you to touch on that.
It definitely changed, and it took some time for that to happen. It started when, I connected with some people in the HD space, some good friends of mine, throughout college and throughout high school, just kind of being that support system for me. But it was my senior year in college where I lost a good friend of mine, his name was Jake, to an unexpected fire, and it was very challenging because although I didn't know him as long as some of his other friends, I felt like we really bonded on building a great connection, and really just the idea of living in the moment and trying to live day by day is something that resonated with me, that I continue to breathe and live by through him and through what he showed me and just how he lived his life. And then, a year after that, losing a friend of mine to the juvenile version of Huntington's disease. So as you mentioned, people may start showing symptoms between ages 30, 40, 50, but then there's, depending on your chromosome repeat, your mutation repeat, it can expand to a higher CAG repeat. And so the higher it is, the more progressive it tends to be. So, this juvenile version it progresses when you could be a kid or a young adult. And fortunately, one of my friends lost her battle at the age of 26, but she was always sharing her story. She was always looking at life with a smile on her face. And then there's obviously my mom, with her just continuing to live life even with the crappy situation. So I try to use those as motivation to continue to move on, but it's definitely challenging because I've learned over time that it does take an emotional toll on myself of, am I doing enough? But then self-care, and then understanding it's okay to be vulnerable and say, hey, I'm having a bad day, I'm having a tough time, and reaching out to my support system, reaching out to the resources as needed, whether it's talking to a professional or looking online for information that I need to learn more about.
Right.
But it is tough. It's mentally tough because just that could be me one day.
Right.
And I have to figure out, okay, well, if it is, do I live so far ahead in the future, or do I live kind of in the moment? And that's where I have difficulty at times to remind myself to live in the moment and continue to do the work I'm doing in the health space. Yeah,
well, you're doing great work. Thank you for sharing that. I think that is a piece that isn't talked about a lot, and I think it's so important because so many people go through that, mental battle in their heads, do I live for the moment, which you kind of want to, but then you need to plan, and how do you make that all work? So thank you for sharing that. Finally, what does your future hold? What are your dreams and goals for the future?
Besides saving the world and
Yes. Okay, sounds good. I like it.
So I'll briefly touch upon this, but currently career-wise, working for a social health network, social health company called Inspire, that we connect patients and caregivers to one another. And my role is as partnerships manager is to build online communities and build relationships, I guess, more importantly, with patient advocacy organizations, and really trying to find a place for patients and caregivers to connect with one another anonymously. And it's interesting because when I was looking for a job after finishing up grad school, I was debating whether or not I wanted to focus on youth development work, which is where my previous experience was, or if I wanted to get more in the rare disease space. And luckily I found this job, which helps me continue to grow and gain experience and skills needed to get to where I want to be. And ultimately, I would love to continue working with this younger generation and providing these year-round services for them, whether it's in-person meetups, online support, mentorship program. Because a lot of times we'll go to these conferences. We were at Global Genes, and you go to this, you meet people, you get excited, you connect, but then after a couple of months, that's all dies down, and then they're back to their everyday lives. And I think that's okay, but also it's like, well, how do you keep them connected? How do you make sure that they are doing okay? How do you make sure they're getting the right support? And I think that's where I really want to drive my passion is, let's connect these young adults in different, rare disease or chronic condition spaces to one another so that they can help each other out and build not only a relationship, but then build something bigger than that.
Right. Sounds like you're saving the world.
I'm trying.
Excellent. Keep up the good work.
Thanks, Lisa.
Yeah, thank you so much for being a guest today. We really appreciate it. Your story is so moving, and it's so important to educate our viewers about rare diseases and genetic testing. Before closing every show, we provide our viewers with an opportunity to share comments and ask questions. Rare New England in Motion is the perfect way to expand upon our mission. Please send us your questions and comments to info@rarenewengland.org. We will share our responses on our next show. We recently discussed the goals and initiatives for Rare New England. We received one question from a viewer. He asked about how he can help with the healthcare legislation that we discussed. We encourage you to check out our website and visit the healthcare legislation page. You can also call or email us if you would like to talk about getting more involved in advocating for the Rare Disease Council bill. We can talk you through the different possible modes of engagement. That's our show for today. Thank you again to Seth Rotberg for being our guest. Please let us know your comments about this show or an email with any questions. We will respond during our next show. From all of us at Rare New England and all the patients and families who keep rare disease in motion, thank you for watching. And remember, when you hear hoofbeats, think horses and then zebras.